Yeah. Okay. Does everyone have a sheet for tonight? Latter Prophets. You may or may not need it. I'm working on the next one. This week has really changed from what I thought it was going to be to what it became. So I am 80% done with that. Actually, probably 90% done. I could probably finish it right now and print it, but we're not going to wait on me to do that. So what we've been going through, and really one of the reasons why we've been going through it the way that we've been doing is so you can kind of see how the Bible is designed to be a literary work. And a lot of times, once again, we've talked about this concept. Sometimes we think the Bible is just this, as history was playing, someone was just kind of, unthoughtfully, just anything they could see, anything they saw, they just wrote and transcribed, and we just got whatever happened. Well, these stories were passed down and passed down and passed down and passed down, and then written down in a certain way, and they were organized in a certain way to help better understand the flow and the thought process behind the Bible. And it's all leading somewhere. It's all going somewhere, right? We're heading towards something. So when you're reading your Old Testament, especially a Jewish Old Testament, the way it ends is kind of on this cliffhanger. Actually, the New Testament one does too. Malachi kind of ends with that Elijah. But we've been kind of going through the Hebrew setup of the Bible, which looks much different than ours, and it's in three major sections: the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, right? And so we've already kind of been looking at the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the law, right? Genesis to Deuteronomy. Then you've got the prophets, we'll just call it the prophets. There's the former prophets, which starts with Joshua, to the latter prophets, which ends with Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel is the last book in that. So all your historical, but it's from the perspective of the prophets. So we don't see Joshua as a prophet because we see him in our, someone open that door, as a historical book, but the Jews saw Joshua as a prophet because remember, Moses was a prophet, was the prophet, and then Joshua comes and takes the same role as Moses did, okay? Joshua becomes a second Moses. And remember, one of the prophecies in the Torah was that there would come a prophet that was like Moses. Well, what you're seeing is all of the latter prophets, they don't hold up to the same standard that Moses does, so we're still kind of waiting on that prophet, right? And so that prophet's kind of left there's no closure there in the sense of who is the identity of this prophet, okay? And what it does is it gives us a history of how well do the Jews follow their own law, right? Remember, we talked about the Old Testament. A lot of our historical books it's a select history of a select people during a select time. And you don't even have all of the history. There are times we have 400 years of gaps in between, Exodus, right? Genesis and Exodus. There's almost a 400-year gap. Why don't we have, are there things that happened during those 400 years? Right? Are there things that maybe even stories that got passed down that happened in those 400 years? Why were they not included? Right? And so even in your New Testament, when you're writing about, remember what John says about Jesus? The Gospel of John, what does it say? There are so many things. There's so many other things that could have been written about Jesus that could not contain in books. But what has been written, right? What I am writing is so that you may believe. John had a specific purpose. Okay, and what I'm saying is the Old Testament structure and design has a purpose. And remember, we saw these little notes at the end of almost every section or every book that shows that these were written down. Like at the end of Judges where it says there was no king at that time in Israel. Well, that most likely was written during a time when there was a king. And he's explaining to a group of people who've always lived under a king in Israel that this was during a time where there was no unified monarchy, okay? And so we've went through the Torah. We went through most of the prophets. We're kind of in, if you have your last page, the latter prophets. If you don't have one and need one, let me know. All right? Let's hope I have some more. All right, I do have a couple. I might have to go make some. How many people raised their hand? 2? All right, I might need to go You have an extra? Okay. Well, if you could share one just for tonight, I'm going to have to make... Oh, nope, I got two. And I didn't give you guys one of these, but here's a... At the end, what I'm going to do is I'm compiling all this stuff together. I know you guys got it in loose, and I'm going to email all the PDFs out eventually so you guys can save them onto your computers. Okay? But it is helpful for you guys to be looking at them. It'd be helpful if I had mine while we're going through it. So last week we ended with Jeremiah, and we looked at how Jeremiah fits into the scheme of bringing about the Messiah. And Jeremiah's big thing was, first, they were going to live in exile. And what were they to do when they were living in exile? What kind of people were they supposed to be? How were they supposed to treat those people who basically brought them into captivity? What were they supposed to do? Huh?
Kind and loving.
They were supposed to be kind and loving, right? They were supposed to seek the welfare of the city, seek the welfare of the people. They were supposed to grow as a nation. And it's interesting that God reuses this idea over and over and over again, this concept. Remember, when they're in Egypt, what does Exodus 1 tell us about when the Pharaoh looked at the Hebrews? They grew so much in number. That's the seed promise, that their seed would be blessed. They were growing so fast and so quick in number that the Pharaoh recognized, he didn't say that about any other people group. It was the Hebrews, right? That they were growing so fast that if we don't stop this, they're going to overtake us, okay? And so that's a census thing, right? That's a, hey, wait, every year it seems like this group is getting exponentially, more numerous. Well, what is that? You think that has anything to do with God? You think that has anything to do with God's seed promise? That in your seed all the nations will be blessed? And one of the blessings that Moses says that God would do with the covenant Israel was that if they were faithful, that his seed would bless. So remember, every time you see a place like Hannah where they're not able to get pregnant, right? You understand that there's an issue with the covenant. There's an issue. They're living under a time of the curse rather than under the time of blessing. There's sin, right, in Israel. There's something that is wrong. And these stories, really what they're teaching us, all of the prophets that we've been looking at from Joshua all the way to Ezekiel, is that Israel, how well do they live up to the covenant promises? They don't. There is pockets, there is people, but even those people, even a person like David, remember David kind of gets exalted to kind of be the man after God's own heart. But after Bathsheba, is he ever the same man? Does he ever return back to that same man who would go fight Goliath? Well, look at his family. Look what he does with his own kids. Look at the census he takes later. Remember, 2 Samuel ends with him taking a census that causes them to go into 7 years of plague. And he has to give a sacrifice for that. So, what Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel are doing, they're beginning the process of, there's always been the seed promise in Genesis 3:15. There's been the promise to Abraham, and there's been the promise to David and his covenant, that there would be this Messiah that would come, seed of woman, seed of Abraham, lineage of David. What Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel start doing is putting some meat, not just make them very general, starts putting some very specifics of when this is going to happen. Because of their unbelief and because of their failure, there's going to be captivity, but don't fear, there's going to be this new kingdom, this new covenant. And that's what Jeremiah emphasizes in Jeremiah 31. He starts this idea of this new covenant, right? This renewed covenant. Remember, we talked about the same promises to Abraham, right? We look at Galatians. When you are baptized into Christ, you become an heir of whom? The promise is to who? To Abraham, right? So it's a renewed covenant that the seed has now come and it's been expanded. And what we're going to see is that Isaiah, Jeremiah are kind of starting also this inclusion of the Gentiles and the nations, which if you've been reading your Bible, God's always been concerned about other nations in the sense of He's always let other people kind of make their way into the covenant, hasn't He? Look at Rahab, right? Look at Tamar. Look at Ruth, right? You're seeing these key people who are already becoming a part of, ultimately, the lineage of Jesus and the people of Israel. And so he's going to, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel are going to use their foundation of what God was doing through them and in them and with them to say that this, your failure, right? Your failure and the need for a Messiah is what ultimately will bring about the new kingdom, okay? And Isaiah spent a lot of time talking about how this child that would be born, remember Isaiah chapter 9, there would be a child that would be born. He'd be called what? Counselor, right? Wise God, the living Father, right? So you're starting to see this God-human, prophecy start to come into fruition. You're looking at Isaiah chapter 11, that this man would have the Spirit of the Lord, right? He would have the spirit of wisdom and knowledge and courage, unlike anybody else. Then you get to Isaiah 53, that this servant would have to be high and exalted. And that term is only ever used with God sitting on his throne. And then you go into the suffering servant. Well, how is Jesus lifted up to the throne of God on his right hand? He had to first suffer, and then he was lifted high and exalted. And so you got this high and exalted Messiah. You got this new kingdom coming. Jeremiah, the emphasis we're going to put on Jeremiah, if you have your notes, that's where I'm just kind of catching you up. Let's go to Jeremiah 31:31. That's where we kind of ended last week. I went over and I rushed, so I want to kind of come back and kind of put it into perspective for us. Jeremiah 31. We read 31 through 34. But I want to look at I want to look at 33. So, for this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Now, here's this concept of this written on the heart, okay? Hasn't that something that God has always desired? Like when you go back to Deuteronomy, God was wanting this to be, I want you to obey me. What is Deuteronomy's big phrase that we looked at when we were in Deuteronomy? Obey the Lord your God with all of your heart. That starts getting added in because what you realize and what you see, especially in the prophets, is can you give sacrifices without heart? Can you offer animals without heart? Yeah, I mean, anyone can go and kill an animal, right, and say, hey, my sins are forgiven, and be done with it. Well, the prophets start saying, what does God start saying about all of their sacrifices that they're giving? I'm no longer going to accept them. I'm not hearing your prayers. You can go through all of the motions, right, but without heart, it means nothing. And so there's this concept that we started looking at, if you were in our Leviticus class Sunday night, of Leviticus 1 is all about the burnt offering, okay? The ascent offering, which means you would take a 1-year male goat or lamb or bird, right, if you were poor, and you would burn all of it, every bit of it to the Lord. And when you go and read, every time you sinned, or every time you felt like you were outside of the grace of God, you had to give one of these offerings. And even when you hurt somebody else, you had to also include with the guilt offering, you had to include a burnt offering. And what we concluded that if someone truly gave a burnt offering for every time they sinned, how many animals are they going to have left at the end of the year? None. And it has to be a specific kind of animal, right? A 1-year-old, how many 1-year-old lambs are you going to have every year? You better be producing, right? They're never going to get beyond 1-year-old. And the point is God is showing them that they could not offer enough blood. They could not offer enough animals. There's not enough animals in the world to cover all of our sin. Okay? And remember, one sin equaled one animal. So imagine your life and think about all the animals that would have had to die for your life. Well, when you start getting into Samuel and the prophets, you start seeing this concept of obedience is better than what? than sacrifice. God understood that. You think God didn't know that you would not have enough animals to cover your sins? But if you were trying, right, and you were giving, and you were doing what was right, and you were loving God and loving your neighbor and offering the sacrifices when you could, especially Day of Atonement. That's why the Day of Atonement was there, by the way, right, was to wash everything that couldn't have been washed that previous year was erased, and you kind of started over. And then he even threw in concepts like the year of Jubilee, right? Every 50 years, the 49th year and the 50th year, the first Sabbath, right, of Passover, it would be a complete restarting. If you owed anybody debt, if you were enslaved to anybody, he forgave it all. And so you're building this concept that we cannot forgive our own sins. And yet, in Isaiah 53, there's this idea that there'd be this man who was coming who, when he died for us, he would be so righteous that he could take people who were not righteous and make them righteous. That is why Jeremiah works, where God can write this on our hearts, where if we love God with all of our heart, soul, strength, and mind, and love our neighbor as ourselves, do we have to be perfect? No. Can you be perfect? No. But can you be a man after God's own heart who has a spirit that wants to serve and follow God? And whenever you fail or fall short of that, Jesus' blood is there continually washing and cleansing you from all sin. And so that's why this new covenant is better. That's what the Hebrew author ultimately builds up to the argument in the book in Hebrews 8 and 9, that all of these things in the Old Testament, they were shadows. They were shadows. They were predicting, they were showing you all of what Jesus is doing for you when you have his blood covering you. And even in Jeremiah, the Hebrew author says that when Jeremiah made this comment, behold, days are coming when I will make a new covenant with you, he said the old covenant was already passing away. And what you're seeing, and you kind of go, well, what does that mean? But if you read your Old Testament, you understand it. They were getting worse and worse and worse after every time they come back. They were bringing less and less of the authentic and the true and what they had at the beginning with them. It became more and more like the other nations every time they came back. Because even when you get to the time of Jesus, you look at all the things that are established, Pharisees, Sadducees, the Essenes, synagogues, where'd they come from? Where do these things come from? They're trying to be like other people so much that all these additions, it doesn't even look. That's why when you a lot of times when people are only acquainted with the New Testament and they're reading what Jesus says about the Jews in the New Testament, well, I mean, they think what Jesus is bringing up, like the Sermon on the Mount, is how all of Jews were supposed to live. He's just saying this system was never supposed to work. No. Paul lets us know in Romans 7 that the law is perfect. What we did with the law was imperfect because we are imperfect. And Paul says when he finally read the law for the first time with Jesus inserted, like with the view of Jesus, he realized that all the things he was trying to do to be righteous, he couldn't do. And the things that he shouldn't have been doing, he was doing. It was just a mess, right? You learned how utterly sinful you were. And so in Jeremiah, God is promising them, okay, exile has come, all right, exile has come, but don't worry. You're going to go into exile, it's going to be okay. God is going to be with you in exile. And what you see is they grow again so much, and that God blesses them so much that when they're actually sent back to the land, they're able to restart an entire nation like that. They're able to rebuild the temple. They've got all the needs met, right? Even the Babylonians allowed the people who stayed in Babylon to send enough money and enough material back. They had they could just start building. No nation could do that coming out of captivity and just start from square one and have all the material they need, all the people they need. They need to rebuild the nation first. Well, that would take hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Well, if they are following God, and that's one of the proofs that God was with them in captivity, okay? And that he's going to make them a new heart. Now, what we're going to see, that's kind of Jeremiah. And that's the really big focus I want you guys to take away. Once again, we're just looking at, we can't go through all of Jeremiah. Jeremiah's got a lot more in there than just that. But at the end of Jeremiah, it ends the same way that 2 Kings ends. And remember, 2 Kings ends with just this random king after exile in Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar has taken over Babylon, has brought Jerusalem into captivity. And if you know, have any of you ever studied world history at all? Just know even a little bit about world history. Are people ever good to their captives? Are they ever good to the ruling captives? Like if you want to really take over another nation, what do you do with the rulers of the previous nation? You kill them, you subject them in some way, right? Put them in slavery, you throw them in prison where no one ever sees them again. That's what you do. But most of the time, it's, the Queen of Hearts. Off with their heads, right? But look how Jeremiah ends. It ends the same way 2 Kings ends. And in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 25th day of the month, evil Merodach, king of Babylon, now Nebuchadnezzar has died by this time, in the year that he began to reign, graciously freed Jehoiachin, king of Judah, and brought him out of prison. And he spoke kindly to him, gave him a seat above the seats of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin put off his prison garments, and every day of his life he dined regularly at the king's table. And for his allowance, a regular allowance was given to him by the king, according to his daily needs, until the day of his death, as long as he lived. There is no other way this situation would happen if God was not saying, I know you're going into captivity, but I am going to bless you. What we're ultimately going to look at today is when we get to Daniel. Daniel chapter 1 is all about God. It says that God did what for Daniel and his friends? He made them higher, right? Gave them a higher wisdom and understanding and knowledge and all skill and all learning, so that they were multiplied times better than, more skilled and more knowledgeable than even their own Chaldean, right, Babylonian wise men and mathematicians in every area. They far exceeded everybody in every single area, and it says God granted them that wisdom. So what we're seeing is that God says, I'm not done with you. I'm not done with you. Because of the covenant that I made with Abraham, because of the seed promise, because of the Genesis 3:15, Genesis chapter 12, Genesis 15, right, 2 Samuel chapter 7, the promise made to David, that's the only reason they are still even have a hope or a chance, that God is still with them, okay? So Jeremiah kind of concludes with, they're in exile, they've been in exile for a while, and all of a sudden, the captives are being good and gracious to those who they've brought into subject under captivity. And ultimately, who is the one who sends Israel back into the promised land? What king? King Cyrus, right? King Cyrus, who is a Persian king. So not only do you have a Babylonian king who was good to Daniel and good to Jehoiachin, who was the king over Israel, now when Persia conquers Babylon, Persia is now good to Israel and its people and allows them to grow and sends millions of people back to Jerusalem. What king in their right mind would send 1 million captive, basically they could be slaves or people, and just say, you know what, go start your own country again. Go back to your own homeland and start your own country back up. I'm just feeling really gracious. God, right? God being rich in mercy. There's that Ephesians 2. We caught up in our trespasses, but God being rich in mercy. Every time they are at the lowest of lows because of sins. I mean, go read the sins in Jeremiah and Isaiah they were committing. They were absolutely horrible. And yet God loved them and saved them and showed divine mercy. Okay? Now the book of Ezekiel. And I'm kind of going quick because we spent a lot of time on Isaiah and Jeremiah. But Ezekiel they're now in exile, and Jehoiachin is Jeremiah is still preaching more to those who live in Jerusalem and letting them know what's going on in Babylon. Ezekiel's kind of flipped. Ezekiel's living in Babylon, and a lot of Ezekiel's weird visions and dreams, he's letting them know what's going on in Jerusalem. Okay? And remember, captivity was in 3 stages. So a lot of the people that Ezekiel's preaching to, especially the first half of the book, are those who went through the first stage, were brought up and carried into captivity, and they're going, what's going on with our family? And Ezekiel's going through some really weird, you want to read one of the strangest prophets out there, go read some things that Ezekiel had to do. All right? At one time, God asked him to lay on his side for an entire year, shave half his beard, right? Lay on the ground and cook all of his food. First, he asked him to do it over people dung, but Ezekiel goes, that would defile me. That's the thing he's concerned about. Not that he's cooking his food over crap, but that it would be people crap, and it would defile him. Okay, you can cook it over cow dung. Okay, I'll do that. And he's like tied up for half it. And then he's doing all these strange, walking around half naked, most of the time. But he becomes a walking parable. He becomes a walking parable of what? One, it's almost as if you had like a play acting of, but let's say before we had the internet, and someone was trying to reenact some war that happened that you never saw. There's a reenactment going on. Ezekiel is the divine reenactment of all the things that are going on in Jerusalem that they're missing out on. But the little bits of hope that he sees in all of this is though he sees the Spirit of the Lord leave Jerusalem. Remember? He sees the Shekinah leave the temple, because the prophets are still over there preaching what? They've already been through 1 or 2 stages of captivity, and by the time Ezekiel sees the Shekinah leave, they're in the 2nd stage of captivity, and the 3rd stage is about to happen where they completely wipe out the temple completely. And you see the Spirit of God leave, but where does it go? It goes over to Babylon. And so he sees the throne of God in Ezekiel chapter 1, one like the Son of Man, sitting on the throne with the cherubim and seraphim coming over and dwelling in Babylon. Is with his people. So here's what you're getting at. When God says, and he says this back in the Torah, and he repeats this through the prophets, I am going to put my name in Jerusalem. Jerusalem became identified with the people, not the place. God was more concerned about the people of Jerusalem than the city of Jerusalem. And so the city of Jerusalem becomes an archetype of God's people and God's realm and domain and ultimately his kingdom. Okay? And so if you're looking at Ezekiel, look at 36. We're going to go to Ezekiel 36 because when you look at the movement of the spirit of Ezekiel, guess where the spirit is ultimately going to fall in Ezekiel? It goes from temple to throne to over Babylon into individual people. All right? So look at Ezekiel 36. All right, somebody read 26 and 27 of Ezekiel 36. Loud and proud.
And I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you. And I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh, and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you, and cause you to walk in my statutes, and to be careful to obey my rules.
Okay, so here's the thing. Now accompanied with this new heart, he's also going to do what? I'm going to put my spirit within you. And then in Ezekiel 37, we have the valley of dry bones. What is the valley of dry bones? Ezekiel goes out to this valley, and he sees all these just bones laying everywhere. And Ezekiel's mourning basically the death of people, and God says, watch. And he reanimates them. Flesh start growing on them, right? Their organs grow back. God breathes his spirit in them. And look at verse 14. Verse 12, here's what he says about this. Therefore prophesy, after he sees all this happen, therefore prophesy and say to them, thus says the Lord God, behold, I will open up your graves. I will raise you from your graves, O people, and I will bring you into the land of Israel. So there's going to be a resurrection. Now, this concept of resurrection, the New Testament picks up on. Does it not? Now, whenever we think of resurrection in the New Testament, what do we normally think of? We think of the final resurrection. But ultimately, the New Testament talks about when Jesus is in you, your resurrection happens then. You die, the old man dies, and you are raised a new man. Like if you are a Christian right now, you've already gone through a resurrection. You have died to old, right? The old man is dead, and you have become new. You have a new heart. And God's Spirit, He says, I'm going to do what? I'm going to put within you. Now keep reading. He says, and you shall know that I am the Lord when I open your graves, raise you from your graves, O my people, and I will put my Spirit within you. You shall live, and I will place you in your own land. Then you shall know that I am the Lord. I have spoken, and I will do it, declares the Lord. Now, interestingly enough, what would be so significant about when Jesus dies on the cross that all of these graves are opened and people rise from the dead? All of these promises are happening into this new covenant, when there'd be this new Spirit, this new kingdom, the Messiah would come. And when Jesus dies, all of a sudden graves are opened. It's a symbol of what is about to happen. It's about what to take place when that first day of Pentecost, when Peter preaches the gospel, right? He preaches the gospel, and he's basically asking people to choose life or death. You can be made new. Yes, you put the Messiah on the cross, but you can be made new. And ultimately, remember when they finally hear the gospel, they say, what shall we do? Repent and be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, and you will receive the gift of the Spirit, right? And then you will become a people of your own possession. These promises were made to you, all who were far off. And it says those who believed him were baptized, right? And they received that Spirit of God within them. So Ezekiel's major concern is that the Spirit is going from Jerusalem temple. And you've seen this development throughout. Where's the first mention of the Spirit in the Bible? Where's the very first mention of the Spirit in the Bible? Genesis 1. The Spirit hovered over what? The face of the earth, and it was involved in creation, was it not? Then Spirit was breathed into man, right? The Ruah was breathed into man. And then you watch the Spirit guide Israel, right? All throughout their life, you have this Spirit guiding Israel, and ultimately ends up in the tent of meeting, right? Then ends up in the tabernacle, is always there wherever the Ark of the Covenant is, and then it's in the temple. Then it moves from the temple in the you're watching this progression of the Spirit go from this very broad, and it's getting narrow and narrower and narrower, and ultimately where the Bible wants to land the Spirit is in each one of us, so that we may individually be temples and be tabernacles and have the Spirit of God in us. And the person who showed us that it could be done is Jesus. Jesus, who was literally born by the Spirit, right, was born by the Spirit, then becomes a symbol of John 3 that we must be born of water and Spirit, right? We must be born again of water and Spirit. And so we must take on this idea. We got to be born. Born again is probably a bad translation, but it's literally born from above. Born of God is really, you're born of man, but you're also born of God. And that's ultimately what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. He says all of us have been born upon the image of Adam, and that was raised from the dirt and the earth. But we all have hope that we will be born again from the one who came down from heaven. All right? So we have this new birth. And Ezekiel, that's its big deal. You watch Ezekiel, and it's interesting. Ezekiel is basically the book of Exodus, but in Babylon. All the things that Ezekiel has to go through are basically your plagues, because those plagues were strange. Imagine living during the 10 plagues of Egypt. I mean, those were, why would he do that? Imagine living and locusts come and eat everything, right? And all of a sudden frogs are just, everywhere out of, why it was very strange. But who else could do that? Who else would be able to do that? And ultimately, it defeated each one of their gods. Now, here's the cool thing about Ezekiel. Moses, through the 10 plagues, defeated all of Egypt's gods. Ezekiel, through all of his play acting, defeated all of Israel's gods. pride, selfishness, their own sin. You watch what he does. He's reenacting and doing something about Israel's own idols that they have set up. And even so much that Ezekiel talks about this, there's this hidden, and it probably wasn't there, but it becomes a representation. Ezekiel spends a lot of time talking about how there's this hidden inner room in the temple where like the priests come together and they scheme. There's 70 of them, which is another symbolic number. They come and they scheme about how they can perpetuate evil throughout Israel, okay? And God basically says, I'm destroying you. I'm going to destroy you, but from your ashes and from your grave, I'm going to make something new. And from the ashes of Israel, that's Romans chapter 11, by the way, they were cut off, right? They were the natural branch and the natural tree. They will be cut off, which allowed the Gentiles to be what? Grafted in. But any Jew who also believed in the Messiah could be grafted back in. So that new was from the ashes of Israel, the seed promise would come through, but all nations would now be able to take a part of this. Isn't that cool? And that's kind of the book of Ezekiel. And it ends, look at 48. All right, is that the second bell? It ends, all of Ezekiel, starting in, I think, about chapter 40, 41, starts talking about the dimensions of this new temple and new city. and when the city is done, the city looks like a garden. And it also serves as a temple. And here's what they name it. And the name of the city, verse 35, the very last verse, and the name of the city from that time shall be called what? The Lord is there. That's why when Jesus comes, he is a representation of the new Israel. The Lord is there. That's why Christ is the head of the body. That's why you get into Christ, who is the church. He is the temple. He is the body. He is the Ephesians chapter 2, and he is the building of the living God. Getting in him. Why? Because the Lord is there. All spiritual blessings are found in Christ. Okay, so we finish. Ezekiel, we're going to finish some of the minor prophet stuff and then jump into part 3. And then once again, in a couple weeks, we're going to go through the whole chronology